Okay, so this is the study guide review for exam 1, gender. All right, so the first question I'm asking about the way that Darwin was arguing that there were inherent differences between men and women, right? So he was saying that those resulted in personality differences. That's all I'm looking for there. When it comes to evolutionary psychology and rape, just that under the banner of evolutionary psychology, there's this argument that rape is an inevitability, right? Because it's due to these ancestral drives that come from, failed mating strategies or whatever it is. Let's see, third one. Just that brain research that they were looking at in chapter 2 was really trying to, when I mean fits into preconceived ideas, that they weren't trying to understand objectively, just scientifically, what was going on in men's and women's brains to see if there were any similarities and differences, but they were basically seeing a social difference and assuming that that means there's a brain difference. Let's see, the same kind of thing when it comes to the search for the gay gene, right? That they were, of course, attempting to show that sexual orientation has a basis in biology. And usually this was done through a series of twin studies, though, it hasn't really been widely replicated since. But some argue that the goal of the research is really to target homosexuality as if it's some sort of birth defect, which is obviously scary. Let's see, next one. Testosterone's permissive effect. Just that there's almost like a chicken before the egg situation. We assume that testosterone means if you have higher testosterone, you are more aggressive. But the relationship is kind of more the other way around. When you're in more aggressive situations or when you're being more aggressive, your levels of testosterone rise. So that's that. And then intersex people. Just that in our culture that's very, has this bifurcation, we have this idea that there's only a dichotomy of men and women. So intersex people become a social problem because they don't fit into the accepted categories of the society. And they challenge our assumptions of this duality of sexes, that you're only men or women, right? Because that really, a people's whole ideology is founded upon those ideas. And then when you kind of break them of that, they are confused, right? So, a lot of people that are intersexed are either as a child forced to go through surgeries or later in life decide to go through surgeries, or sometimes don't, but just, to fit into society, they have to change, basically. All right, caveman masculinity. Okay, so the first one here is just talking about how the combination of scholarly and popular culture waters itself down. So the science that is being published isn't necessarily the kind of findings that we're hearing, or the conclusions of that research are not necessarily making it to the average American, right? It gets a little bit watered down through the popular culture. And in the result of that, the science itself becomes imbued with American manhood ideals, right? So in the chapter, they talk about how the idea that men catcall or cheat or are hypersexual is because of this evolutionary biology, right? That, the kind of women that we say are beautiful in the culture is really just a result of evolution and not the cultural history. Those kind of things. Let's see. Oh yeah, they talk a lot about in this reading that they argue that caveman masculinity is a form of retrosexuality. So they're saying that the narrative itself has this kind of weight of science, right? Because they're saying like, no, this is biologically inevitable. Men are going to be aggressive and dominant, right? This kind of idea. So it encourages this male dominance within the actual culture. And so, if men feel like they're losing power in the larger society because largely they aren't dominant in the same kind of social way as they might have been in previous generations, this narrative gives some sort of proof of dominance, this biological inevitability of dominance, right? So in that way, it's a form of retrosexuality because people kind of cling to it in those situations of social change. Okay, let's see, habitus. That's just Pierre Bourdieu, right? We talked about in class, Bourdieu. His term that talks about internalizing and embodying cultural values. So how the values of the culture actually get into your body, right? And how you act and what you do. Okay, symbolic violence is just the process by which we come to accept and embody power relations that are going on in the culture without even noticing we're doing them, right? And we talked about a few examples of those within that reading. And then the last is just the lure of this caveman narrative, right? That it's appealing to some people because it gives them a logic and origin story for the kind of aggression and social problems we have as a result of that aggression today. So it gives an answer for what motivates men as being just an inevitable biological thing. Like, we don't need to self-reflect. We don't need to think about, why we have these epidemic rates of violence or rape or assault or these other things. It's inevitable, right? That's kind of their argument. And really that means that you don't have to change anything, right? And so again, it's a form of retrosexuality in that way. All right. Let's see, going on to chapter 5, sociological imagination, just the definition they're talking about, right? This is an important concept in sociology in general, that you're trying to connect an individual's biography with the larger social and institutional forces that are structuring their experiences, right? So you can't just look at someone's choices in the individual's context, though those things are also important. You have to also look at what the structure of those choices were, what kind of opportunity structure existed within that time. So the sociological imagination gives you a kind of a full picture look at things, trying to contextualize what you're seeing in the social world, right? Okay, social constructionist perspective. Just that in the chapter 5, they're talking about their understandings and definitions of masculinity and femininity. And so really they're just talking about how these things are variable, right? So they change. They vary from culture to culture, right? They also vary within a culture over a historical period of time, right? They can even vary over the life course of an individual person, right? What it means to be a little girl is different from what it means to be, a young woman than what it means to be an older woman, or what it means to be a boy, from, all these kind of things. These life stages have different meanings imbued within them as well. And also it varies within any culture at any time because of those other intersections, right? So your race, your social class, your ethnicity, your age, right? Your sexuality, the region of the country you live in, a disability, any of these kind of things are going to affect how you are defined or understood as masculine or feminine, right? In this kind of dichotomy. Okay. Gender as a power relation. Okay, so that just means that, gender itself, the gender definitions that we have in the culture, the institution itself that tells us boys do this and girls do that, it ends up producing the differences we see in our performances, right? Because you're policed into, sitting a certain way, acting a certain way, dressing a certain way, all of these kind of things. So we see the differences in the performance of gender, and that kind of re-infuses that power of it, of the definition, right? And so, in this way, it's also a power relation in who has power within the culture, meaning that there is this issue of men being given more power and access in society than women, historically and still in a lot of ways today. But that's still too narrow a perspective to really understand, in that same sociological imagination way, the full picture of what's happening. There's also the power dynamic within gender of some men having power over other men, right? Again, those intersections matter. So race, class, sexuality, these kind of things. Some men have a lot more power and status and privilege than other men. And same thing with women. Some women have more power and privilege and status than other women, right? So gender is a power relation. It's a power relationship. It's a hierarchy. So of course it kind of imbues some people with privilege and other people not so much. All right, gender and aging. Just the idea that we experience aging different because we experience, society different. Pretty straightforward. Gender processes. Just that institutions try to reproduce gender and explain gender to us through these gender processes, right? Where they produce gender divisions for us, right? Have certain symbols and images. So think of a bathroom sign, right? You have a dude in a pants and someone in a dress. It's not like women have to wear dresses, but we still kind of use that as a marker of difference, right? As a symbol of this dichotomy. That's like a gendered process. Or the interactions between people and the kind of work that they have to deal with to construct their understandings of gender. So the symbolic interactionism side of this, where, there's gendered processes to how we talk, to how we interact. And oftentimes, if we're not performing correctly, people will try to correct us, right? Usually our family, our friends, our peers, close people to us, authority figures will often, reinforce the gendered expectations of the culture to you. So again, that produces those gender divisions, and it kind of reinforces them through the interactions. All right. So doing gender, this just means, we're constantly performing our gender, right? So the way that we walk, the way we talk, the way we dress, everything we do, it's very socially constructed, right? We're acting the way that we are because that's what's expected of us in the culture. And so people are going to interpret the way that we act through the lens of our gender performances. And if we're not doing it right, if we're disrupting those expected gender performances, then we're going to receive criticism and social sanctions because of that. Okay, so then this next one, just this idea that scholars agree that rape itself is kind of a form of sexual terrorism, because it serves as a constant reminder to women that they're vulnerable to harm because of their gender, right? Not because of anything they personally did, but just because of how they were born. So we talked about this in class, how many people feel like they have to carry pepper spray, right? That kind of thing. Let's see. Okay, so then going on to the doing gender reading. So the accepted cultural perspective, what I'm talking there is the perspective of the Western world, right? When it comes to gender. So that perspective is viewing men and women as naturally defined categories, right? Coming from biology. So they're seeing the differences between men and women as fundamental and enduring because they're from biology. So they see men and women as having different capabilities and personalities that come from their different reproductive functions, right? That's the accepted Western cultural perspective. Let's see, role theory. So this sees our social roles for men and women as an outgrowth of those natural biological differences. Okay, resources for doing gender. So really all I'm talking about here is that, we get to kind of choose our performances, right? But it's not easy to not perform gender, right? Like you can see this for people that are very non-binary, just even having a word to say, to indicate the person. Like obviously words are changing now. We'll talk about this later as well, but they, them, and these kind of things. If you don't even have a word for someone outside of a he, she lexicon, then it's very difficult for people to even perform outside of that gendered reality. So as much as, yes, we perform gender and we get to choose the way that we perform it, and we do have some agency in that, it is not easy to avoid doing gender, right? It's pretty much impossible to avoid doing it in some way, performing it, that is. Let's see, gender, power, and social change. Just this idea that, we're creating these differences between girls and boys, women and men that aren't natural or essential or biological in the way that we're actually performing this rigid gendered system. So if we just let people perform something that was more appropriate to their own feelings of their gendered expression, boom, people would be able to kind of expand those notions or understandings of the limitations of that gender. Let's see, chapter 3. Okay, variations in gender definitions. So just the idea that when we talk about understandings of masculinity and femininity around the world, they're a reflection of the culture that they come from, right? And the values and meanings of that culture. That's all you need to know there. Functionalist theory, just that they're arguing that a sexual-based division of labor, they believe it was necessary for the preservation of society, right? To have kind of very clearly defined roles for men and women. Let's see, private property and the materialism of male domination. So really, just that Engels and Marx were arguing that the invention of private property is related to the capitalist economy, the nation state, and the nuclear family, and has promoted male dominance because it created a sexual division of labor that said that capitalism really relies upon women's unpaid labor in order to function. And so the things that become women's work then become unvalued, unpaid, and expected. Or at least that's what they were arguing in relation to gender. Because, of course, Marx and Engels are, from a conflict perspective, looking at typically social class issues in capitalism. Let's see, what else? Oh, cross-cultural explanations. So basically, rape is a very gendered and cultural phenomenon. So there's a lot of ways that this works because your culture that you're in is going to affect the frequency of rape, the understanding of rape. Cultures that have more respect for women have lower rates of rape, right? And really, when it comes to the gendered phenomenon aspect, whether the victim is male or female or non-binary, the majority of the perpetrators are male. So the culture ends up kind of promoting certain values that often excuse away rape, such as the caveman narrative, or in some of the cultural definitions they talk about in chapter 3, as an excuse, as a tool of war, right? You use rape as a way to humiliate your conquered enemies by taking their women, right? That kind of thing. So the cultural understanding is also kind of going to play a role into how this actually manifests. Let's see. Okay, so some societies recognize more than two genders. That's pretty much the answer for that one. Right? That's pretty much it right there. All right, ritualized homosexuality. Just that this can be seen in the Zambian and Karaki rite of passage for boys to become men that they talk about in chapter 3. Ethnocentrism, just the definition from that book, is when you judge another culture based on the values and beliefs of your culture, right? When you kind of point a finger at another culture and say they're weird based on your culture, which is also weird. Okay, let's see. Sexual diversity. Just the idea that having sex and what's considered sexual or sexually arousing is very different around the world and has been different throughout times in history, right? So it's very socially constructed. Let's see. What was the next one? Oh, really just the plurality of differences. That if you're looking at sexual habits around the globe, they vary widely from culture to culture, right? And so in some cultures, it's considered really gross to kiss people. In other cultures, it's considered erotic, right? In some cultures, it's thought that, there's all sorts of interesting, weird kind of superstitions or understandings or interpretations of these things that are very culturally specific. All right, let's see. Men as women, women as men. Okay, so modern day gender identity, sexual identity, sexuality. So all I'm looking for here is that in our culture, when someone is born with ambiguous genitalia or they're intersexed in some sort of way, we tend to think that the best way to deal with that is through some sort of corrective surgery to put them into one of those two categories, right? But that's not necessarily the way that other cultures understand this. So, when it comes to gender identity, sexual identity, and sexuality, we assume that all of these things are linked to a biological identity, right? We assume that you are biologically born male, then your gender identity is then male, your sexual identity is then heterosexual, and that your sexuality itself is practiced in a very rigid definition of what heterosexual is within our culture, right? Okay. Let's see, Dominican Republic. Just that in the in the reading, they were looking at this genetic phenomenon that was happening in the Dominican Republic, right? Where there was these children that at birth they looked female, but then they virilized once they hit puberty, right? We talked about that in class. In Papua New Guinea, right? Kind of similar, but there's just this intergender category of these male pseudohermaphrodites. So, meaning instead of looking like female at birth, they basically just don't have the capacity to virilize themselves, right? They basically are raised in anticipation of hoping that they will become male fully, but because they're not able to virilize, they can't take part in the intergenerational semen transmission rituals, and as a result, they're kind of ostracized as men, right? Because they're like problematic men, right? We talked about that. MTF, FTM, it's just the terminology, right? The book gets into a little bit about how if a person in our culture transitions from one gender to another, right? Typically, it's a directional relationship in our binary system, right? So male to female, female to male, MTF, FTM, right? All right, what's next? Oh, gender identity. Again, the gender identity, gender status are distinct from sexual desire, right? That your gender, your understanding of if you are male or female in a binary system of male or female, or, in a system that's opening like we are, male, female, not binary, that is different from who you desire having sex with, right? And we're going to talk about this more in depth later, give more examples, but, it's interesting that people have conflated this as a straight line. Again, that you're biologically born, that your gender is a reflection of that biological distinction, and that your sexuality is heterosexual, just automatic. So what we call compulsory heterosexuality. So, it's really interesting though that people conflate these things. So like if someone is trans, right, and they have transitioned to a female gender identity, right? If she sexually desires someone that, is the opposite gender identity, then that would still be considered heterosexual in our culture, right? So the way that we assume sexuality in connection with these kind of like gender transgressions, it's not necessarily cut and dry, right? Who you desire and how that works is very different from what you internally feel as to who you are on a gender spectrum, right? Anyway. The English Renaissance, just that people during the English Renaissance that were transvestites were not just fighting against the gendered order of the time, which of course they were subverting gender for sure, but they were also subverting the social hierarchies that said that certain people wore certain kind of clothes depending on their social class. So it was basically seen as like dressing outside of your social station, right? Social institution of gender. Okay, so basically there I'm just talking about the overall, the way that gender itself establishes expectations for how we're going to act, right? What our beliefs should be. It gives us roles, and responsibilities for, who to be, how to be. And it really normalizes that men and women are mutually exclusive and that there's no other categories possible. Other genders, just that, as we talked about in chapter 3 and, other ways that there are other non-Western cultures that understand gender differently than we do, that have a space for third, fourth, or sometimes just multiple genders, and don't have the same kind of binary understanding of gender that our culture does, which really does show that it's a reflection of the culture more so than a reflection of biology. And then the last one, the other, never both. So that phrase just means that, again, with that kind of straight line understanding of biology connecting to gender, connecting to sexuality, like there's this idea that it's biological, so it's just set for life. So we're told that, there's only these two things, these binaries, and that your sex and your gender is supposed to connect. And that doesn't always happen, right? So we have no social place in the culture, some space for people to be, one, the other, but never both, right? This never both. We don't give us a third space, an optional other space for what other expressions of gender could be that could be appropriate, right? So if you're neither woman nor man, where do you fit in a binary? You don't, right? So that's kind of how this works. People are starting to really break down this notion of the binary just by living and showing opposition to it, right? That kind of agency that we have. Anywho, all right, short answer essay questions. Okay, so from the film we watch in class, why do you think people in this country may not be aware of the issues presented in the film? What can be done to raise the profile of these issues? So this is you, this is your opinion. Hopefully you can answer that. That's not something I should necessarily have to answer for you. here, what I'm going to be looking for from a grading perspective is if you're like naming what these issues actually are, right? And, giving some concrete ways that this could actually, you could raise the profile of these issues, right? Because they're important things. Let's see. And then number 2, what does it mean to do gender? In what ways does gender structure our everyday lives? So doing gender, we talked about this a lot. It's a performative aspect of the expectations of society that gets into your body through habitus, right? And you kind of are a representation or a reflection of those gendered understandings, but you kind of put your own little spin on it, right? And the way you perform it every day. So it kind of breaks down when you choose, it breaks down, right? So in what ways does gender structure our everyday lives? Well, that is something that I'm going to expect kind of concrete examples from you guys, because there's a million ways that it structures our everyday lives, right? In every social institution that we're a part of, right? So we talked about that with, the criminal justice system, or religion, or your family, or education, or anything. There's all of these kind of social divisions in the way that gender structures the differences we have in our lives. We talked about the differences in aging, or the differences in, just all sorts of experiences. So I'm going to look for something specific there from you as an example of that. And then as far as the short answer essay questions, it doesn't have to be like a full page or anything, even though you have like that much space to use. You just have to answer each question, right? It's a 2-part thing. Make sure you fully answer each question and you're good, right? So hopefully this is helpful. And yeah, this is the review.